Welcome to the Spring 2022 Action Book Club on the Holly by Julian Rubenstein. This ABC is hosted by the College of Education Student Association at the Morgridge College of Education, University of Denver, and will be recorded. This quarter's book club series will feature presenters discussing topics related to the importance of educational justice in Denver and opportunities for action to positively impact our communities. I am Katie Goldie, PhD student of Educational Leadership and Policy Studies and president of the College of Education Student Association. I'll be moderating today's session on Young Aspiring Americans for Social and Political Activism, presented by Dr. Janiece Mackey, founder of YAASPA, YASPA, and DU alumna from the Educational Leadership and Policy Studies. Welcome, Janiece. So we're going to start with just a few questions. If you could start by introducing yourself and share a little bit about your current role.
Yeah, sure. So again, good evening. My name is Dr. Janiece Mackey. I'm the co-founder and executive director of YASPA, which stands for Young Aspiring Americans for Social and Political Activism, or YASPA for short. I started the organization when I was 25, which I'll jump into more in my presentation. So we're 12 years old. And I'm also a researcher. So I'm a postdoctoral researcher with Rutgers, Newark University. And I'm studying and researching and better understanding youth agency and nexus with career equity.
What changes are you trying to bring about for our communities?
Oh, wait, that's a lot.
Small steps. And then big.
Yeah, I think the way I would probably answer that question is one, honoring what already exists. Right. And so a lot of times when we think about change, we think that there's something that needs to be done because something doesn't exist. And I'm very much about really trying to unveil the pre-existing wisdom, right, of our youth village, Black and Brown leaders in the community and what's already happening, and further creating synergy around that. So that's one, that unveiling, that's a change for sure. But also really changing the way we think about and conceptualize activism and civic engagement, and really thinking more about healing justice work and particularly healing-centered engagement, which Dr. Sean Ginwright talks a lot about as well.
And you shared this a little bit, but why are you passionate about this work?
So this will get into my story a bit in the presentation as well. But I'm very much passionate about this work because I know as someone who grew up in Aurora, who once was an aspiring attorney, which I'm not, I entered into education, and from the nonprofit sector to the policy sector, I often did not necessarily see myself represented, particularly as a young Black activist and community organizer. And so I was like, I'm going to create a space at the age of 25 years old for us to reclaim academic, career, and civic spaces. This is legacy work to me. This is something where I'm really hoping that the younger generations can see a new way of being and existing as it pertains to engaging in transformational change and civic engagement in policy and public administration spaces.
That's really, thank you so much for sharing that, sharing a bit about yourself and your passion. This is just increases my excitement for your presentation, which we will now transition into.
Awesome, thank you so much. I will share my screen. All right. Y'all can see my screen okay, yes?
Yes.
Awesome, thank you so much. Thank you so much again for having me. Let's see. All right, so what I'm hoping to address in our time together is a bit, of course, about YASPA and what we do, how we position ourselves, youth and race work, shifting the landscape, and then if we have time for questions, we'll do questions. So I do want to do not a typical land acknowledgement. Definitely want to honor the lands of which we sit, right? The Cheyenne, the Ute, and Arapaho tribes, but also really embracing and honoring Indigenous ways of knowing as well. And so that's challenging normative assumptions of progress, resisting separating our souls from the work, refuting individualism, and going deeper beneath the superficial and the surface. I also want to do a family acknowledgement as well. I know that this series has been place-based, and I want to honor my ancestors, but also my family who comes from the Park Hill and Five Points area. And so my father, he went to George Washington High School. He was a part of the Five Points area, and he met my mom, who was living in Park Hill. And they both went to Smiley Middle School, and she ended up going to East High School. So they were rivals in some ways, but they ended up together. They moved me to Aurora, and I went to private school up through 4th grade, and then transitioned to public school in 5th grade. And this for me was kind of one of my first initial awakenings, if you will, to understanding and seeing the structural differences and systemic differences in education. Unfortunately, when I was in 5th grade, I didn't have the language or understanding as to why necessarily they were different. And so I'd internalized that in problematic ways. And it wasn't until I ended up homeless in 6th grade with both of my parents and sister as a housing justice issue that I realized that things happen outside of school, right? And so this for me was again an awakening of the injustices and the inequities and the changes that were needed as it pertains to education and the supports that youth and families deserve. And so from there in middle school, I thought I was going to be a lawyer because that's what I was exposed to, right? Lots of Johnny Cochran, lots of Perry Mason, and thinking that that was the lever, if you will, to create change. I was on the accelerated path in middle school, but then I was actually detracked in high school. I was detracked in that many of the friends that I had classes with in middle school, I did not get to have class with in high school. Many of them got invited to the AP party, so to speak, that advanced placement party. And I was not invited necessarily, right? So I had 1.5 AP courses, a semester of AP physics, and the other one was Spanish, so hablo español. But that was it, right? I was a 2.8 19 ACT youth. So I was very much invisibilized in that I wasn't deemed gifted, but I wasn't cutting up either. So I really wasn't getting attention necessarily in high school. My counselor told me there was a filing cabinet in the corner when it came time to apply for schools. And so I really honestly didn't know what to do necessarily, despite the fact that I'm not technically first gen. My grandparents actually went to University of Denver on my mother's side. My grandpa, he's an MSW actually. And my grandma, she went to the women's college actually when it was placed in Park Hill. But there was a generational gap. And my parents went to trade school. So went to University of Denver actually for undergrad and was honestly fighting for my life in the classroom in many ways. Fighting a lot of deficit narratives about Black folks, Black youth, and what we do and how we move, right? And then I was in some ways being tokenized in civic engagement spaces and campaign spaces, but not realizing it at the time. Ended up pregnant with my first child my junior year, and a lot of folks told me to drop out and to stop out, but I ended up graduating early because I was like, I mean, it's just a baby, right? That's what my dad said. He was like, people have been having babies for years, niece, you're gonna be fine. Graduated early and didn't end up going to law school, but actually ended up in the realm of education as a bilingual counselor and working with foster youth. And I just quickly fell in love with working with young people on the front end and realized being a lawyer would be too late. But as I was navigating the nonprofit sector and ed spaces, I didn't necessarily see myself represented, but I also saw, unfortunately, this cycle, right, of the youth who looked like me, moved like me, experiencing a lot of the same injustices that I had experienced in my childhood as well. And so at 25 years old, I decided that I was going to start an organization, which is Young Aspiring Americans for Social and Political Activism, or YASPA for short. And so now, 12 years later, these are the programs that we have. We have courses at the middle school and the high school level. We have paid fellowships and internships, a summer social sciences and policy institute, a Community College of Aurora partnership where we can provide students with a 2-year scholarship, a Centering Community Wellness and Resilience program, which is where we're really just trying to care for the needs of our youth village, family, and elders. That was started amidst COVID and the deepened racial reckoning. Our Y Incubator, which is our codified social science workforce development program. A new program this summer, which is our Young Men of Color Summer of Activism, and youth councils, where a lot of our youth participatory action research happens. These are the 4 anchors of YASPA: racial identity development, civic literacy, civic engagement, and academic career and civic efficacy, are our 4 areas of focus. Now, I will say that I think it's really important that executive directors and founders, and as a Black leader also, I name some of the pitfalls that I experienced early on in my journey. We know that performance as a leader, but definitely myself as a Black leader, is racialized, right? And so that was imposed upon me, the organization, and the students. And so early on in my journey, when I was thinking about civic engagement, I was thinking about it in very performative ways, right? So for example, hey, they think that we don't care as much about civic engagement, right? So we have to tirelessly burn ourselves out and be everywhere at every meeting, and show up at every opportunity, quote unquote, right? That we're asked to attend. And so much of that led to feelings like this, right? Creating displacement within even a youth-centered space, right? And so that was something that I really had to reckon with, and reconcile and unlearn early on in the development of YASPA. So these are 3 of our students who co-wrote an article with us, right, on experiences of displacement in a space even that's youth-centered. Leilani indicated, if there's someone who has more power than you in a society with a certain identity, you'll feel it. And Julia indicated, my group and I weren't viewed at the same value as the other presenters there. This was a conference, and it wasn't because our experiences weren't valid, but because of our age. We were asked to present statistics and other evidence to back up experiences we had when nobody else there was asked the same. And Jose reminds us, one example of how I was displaced academically was how teachers and administrators would continually make decisions about my education without fully knowing me or my learning style. And so I had a lot of unlearning to do, right, with regards to the performativity of activism and the performativity of civic engagement. And so I had to learn, right, that it's definitely dehumanizing, right, to be getting outcomes, on the backs of Black and Brown students. And so Soto reminds us that while the neoconservative, neoliberal evocation of colorblindness might seem like a step in the right direction, it actually has the insidious effect of promoting and preserving the continuing organization of social inequality and oppression along racial lines. And it tends to rationalize injustice as well, particularly racial injustice. And Baez reminds us that scholars, activists, and practitioners must criticize the practices and the norms that create the conflicting demands in the first place. And so, again, I had a lot of reconciling and unlearning, and even healing myself as a young activist to do in the ways in which I was moving with our young activists at the time early on in the organization. And so with that in mind, with further education, right, and healing and unlearning along the way, as Angela Davis reminds us, I am no longer accepting the things I cannot change, I'm changing the things I cannot accept. And so I had to do some soul work, right? And for me, that was really starting with my positionality. Initially, when I was thinking about my positionality, I was very much thinking about it in quantitative ways, right? Like, oh, this percentage of me is this is how I move, right? Particularly speaking, I was very enamored with critical race theory. And critical race theory is great, right? However, what was happening is that it was being romanticized. And so critical race theory was not enough. People were beginning to pick up the term and use it in ways that were still othering. So folks, for instance, would say, oh yeah, we do race work, right? And we're doing it because they, right, rather than we type language, need to fight for, work for racial justice and undo white supremacy. And so what I was experiencing as a Black leader with regards to critical race theory was that issues of race were still simply about us, right? Rather than there being more of a we. And so that's where pivot to my research positionality on the other side here. I said, I need to have an eclectic of critical theories of race to play with, right, in doing race engaged work. So rather than only focusing on critical race theory, I also focused on human development and particularly racial identity development and critical whiteness studies as well. So that in having different dialogues across race, right, folks were able to dig into their own positionality and produce some race grounded reciprocity, right, in our partnerships and what we do. And of course, as a founder, right, that individual positionality work then leads to the community organization's positionality as well. There are actors of these organizations, of course, y'all, including mine. And so it was very important to me to do my own soul work in order to understand how the organization would be positioned and received and understood in the ecosystem as well. This is my team, so shout out to the team. So even for example, just as a brief example, in thinking about organizational positionality, one of the things that we do to really have a critical lens with youth engagement and community organizing and healing centered justice is really even thinking about social capital as cultural capital. So oftentimes, you know, social capital, which is kind of reemerging as a term in philanthropy as well as community organizations, it's a very classist way, right? And sort of a colorblind way of thinking about capital. And so we adhere to cultural capital and really thinking about the cultural ways in which we move as BIPOC folks, right? And really honoring what is often invisibilized as well in the ways in which we navigate systems. With that said, though, we know, as Patricia Hill Collins reminds us, that oppressed groups are frequently placed in the situation of being listened to only if we frame our ideas in the language that is familiar to and comfortable for a dominant group. This requirement often changes the meaning of our ideas and works to elevate the ideas of dominant groups. And so what that transitions me to thinking about and naming is these moments of interest convergence along the way that we've had to experience, that I've had to experience as a Black leader, but also our team and our youth village have had to experience as minoritized bodies. And so interest convergence, it comes from critical race theory, right? It views policy as a mechanism that delivers progressively greater degrees of equity, but a process that is shaped often by the interests of the dominant white population. We know that this is derived from the work of Bell, right, in his analysis of Brown v. Board of Education. And we've seen and do continue to see today the ramifications, right, of resegregation and the desegregation that happened at the expense of Black educators and Black youth and families. And also, there's an indication that racial justice is only tolerable so far in that it does not impose major disruptions to the normal way of life of the majority of white folks. And so with that said, you know, we continue to see these moments of interest convergence, I would argue, because of the administrative racism cycle that my colleagues and I have developed. And so what happens, right, is this nervousness around race and talking about race and doing something about race, right? But then we get caught up oftentimes in technical rationality, right? So what's happening even right now, we're seeing is Jedi work. Right now, the new thing is Jedi, justice, equity, diversity, inclusion work, right? And people are going to quote unquote said experts who indicate that they supposedly do this work, right? I was chopping it up with somebody recently and they're like, do y'all do Jedi work? And I was like, we don't use that language because the way I built the organization is simply the ethos of that. Like I live that, right? We live that as an organization. And so what happens is we continue to see these moments of interest convergence, right? Because of not really digging into the soul work of thinking about race and racism and white supremacy. We get caught up in that technical rationality and continue to reify interest convergence moments. And so this is what it looks like, right? The socio-political context of administrative racism happens. That is imposed on philanthropy. Philanthropic responses are then, of course, imposed upon us as community organizations, and particularly Black leaders of community organizations, which leads to racialized organizational responses, right? And have to name, right, emotional labor and cultural taxation of Black leaders and our respective constituencies that we're working with, and in our case, BIPOC youth, right? And then there's this moment of interest convergence. And so in order to try and slow that and push and resist against that, right, we very much don't simply use YPAR as a method, but we have an ethos of youth participatory action research, which is really about partnering with youth as researchers and co-designers of anything that we do. And so we had to come to this place, right, in thinking about, you know, in naming, we are worthy of co-created racially just outcomes. What often happens though with youth participatory action research is it's slower, it's relational, right? It's messy, but necessary. And we're constantly kind of coming up against policy timelines all the time, which I want to name, right? It could be the legislative session. It could be the end of the school year for respective school boards, right? And so then we're constantly having to think and wonder, right, as Black leaders, are we willing to generate policy for racial justice based upon these imposed timelines, right? Which again is this moment of interest convergence that we oftentimes have to reckon with. And there was some deeper reckoning, right? With obviously the incessant onslaught of murder on Black bodies, minds, and souls, right, in 2020. And with that, in nexus with COVID, right, a lot of folks were tapping our organization, right? And we're expecting things of us and we're wanting to extract from us in many ways. And so the reckoning mantra for 2020 that I came up with is your awakening to white supremacy is not our emergency. And engaging in this notion of refusal so that we could protect our minds, bodies, and souls in the process. And so with that in mind, right, we're constantly thinking about the ways in which race and power ebbs and flows through our bodies. And so this is a constant check for us internally that we think through as a village, a YASPA village, and with partners. And it's about ways in which we've experienced power to, over, with, and within. And going even deeper, really having to think through in what ways do we see Blackness, experience Blackness, understand Blackness, and honor Blackness along the way as well. And not simply have to understand our Blackness in juxtaposition to whiteness. And so in my dissertation in 2020, it was about Black undergraduate students who were navigating political science. And they were coming from various higher ed four-year institutions that were predominantly white. And so I really came up with this concept around Black finesse for the following reasons, of which I'll walk you through. So first, Blackness is about simply existing, right? Simply being Black. And then if we're familiar, right, of course, with Negressan's Cross's work, that's really about that identity experience, of navigating Blackness, which we know is not linear, right? Even though it has been indicated as such. And then Black excellence has been talked about a lot, right? And look, I'm all here for Black excellence, right? But here's where I push a bit with regards to Black excellence. It can be commodifying, right? And it can be extremely performative, which can lead to othering. And so Black finesse for me, this concept I came up with in my dissertation, was really about centering and honoring the psychological negotiations that we have and that we exert that may or may not be for the consumption of others. Indicating, right, the ways in which we choose to navigate these systems are not always going to be named, unveiled, right, or performative. And this image here from my dissertation, I think really illustrates that, and that's really the way that we've tried to move in YASPA as well. I engaged in some artistic methods, and I had asked this participant to draw the ways in which he experienced race as a child and the ways in which he experienced race in political science. And what you see here are two images that are very similar, actually. And so what she was naming, right, was like, I'm not here to perform for y'all, right? I'm here to be a student, essentially, right? And I am not necessarily going to exert a lot of emotional labor for other people's consumptions. Y'all are not going to get a performance from me, right? And that was just extremely eye-opening for me, right? Especially in this time where we're experiencing this deepened racial reckoning and trying to honor our minds and bodies and souls in the process. And so with that, you know, YASPA desires to re-envision policy engagement and civic outcomes and activism and really root our work in the critical agency of our young people and really shift, you know, what civic engagement looks like, feels like, and sounds like. So I want to leave folks with this, right? This is from, there's a new book that's been released by Dr. Shanjin Wright, which I highly recommend, entitled The Four Pivots. And he cites Howard Thurman in his book and indicates laws are limited in that they can only establish the climate or the rules for fellowship, but they are limited in that they cannot guarantee the spiritual and moral requisites of a beloved community. This work must happen over time with the process of moral practices that cultivate a climate of grace and compassion. Without this, we are only building the symbols of a great society. And I think this is critical to name, especially for those of us who do propose, right, to engage in policy, right? And so this is really helping me for sure as well in our team to really revisit, you know, what policy even means, right? Shifting to small p policy, processes, politics, procedures, right? Rather than only simply thinking about policy as the end goal, because that implementation process and the spiritual compass, right, that is digesting and internalizing and implementing those policies matter. This is something else I'd like to put in the space as well, from Dr. D.L. Stort. They ask some really dope questions, which are: diversity asks, who is in the room? Equity responds, who is trying to get in the room but can't? Whose presence in the room is under constant threat of erasure? Inclusion asks, have everyone's ideas been heard? Justice responds, whose ideas won't be taken as seriously because they aren't in the majority. Diversity asks, how many more of, you name the identity, right, particularly minoritized identity, group do we have this year more than last? Equity responds, what conditions have we created that maintain certain groups as the perpetual majority here? Inclusion asks, is this environment safe for everyone to feel like they belong? Justice challenges, whose safety is being sacrificed and minimized to allow others to be comfortable maintaining dehumanizing views? With that, I will transition to my last call to action, which is to support us for our upcoming karaoke fundraiser, June 4th at Q's Cuisine. Super excited to be able to have this event come back. We obviously haven't had it over the past couple of years due to COVID. But this year we're super excited to have it because we're going to be honoring particularly vendors who really helped us to be able to do what I call the village work, right? With our youth families and elders, from food, right, to helping with financials, educator coaching, one-on-one coaching, providing therapy to our youth village. We're gonna be honoring these folks at our karaoke fundraiser, and I do sing as well, y'all. So would love for you all to come out and support us. You can also find this information on our website. And with that, I close.
That was such an incredible presentation. Thank you so much. I am going to admit I was actually taking some notes while you were speaking, and that's so powerful. Thank you. Speaking to the call to action, you mentioned the karaoke, but we did want to ask, what are ways that we as educational researchers and practitioners can help support our schools and larger communities?
Whew, lots to do, y'all, for real. I would say being willing to go slow to go fast, first and foremost. I say that because, you know, in education, whether it's K-12, higher ed, researcher, practitioner, educator, there's a lot of gimmicks, right? There's a lot of like new shiny tools, if you will, that folks are trying to pick up in this time. And so rather than simply being attracted to these new shiny tools, whatever they may be, right? Jedi or whatever, SEL, you know, social emotional learning, all of these different types of tactics, really being willing to do the soul work as to why you're drawn to that, and being willing to do the relationship building work with our young people and focus on mental health, being willing to get out of simply quantitative measures, right? But willing to do more relationship building work, so that those quantitative measures can actually shift, right? So for instance, if we're really trying to think about the school to prison nexus, right? And we're saying, hey, we really want to stop criminalizing our young Black boys, girls, young femmes, right? What's happening for that to even be able to be the case in your culture, right? Because simply keeping them in the classroom and criminalizing them is not going to work either, right? So really being willing to do that messy relationship and healing centered engagement work.
In follow-up, just one question is, what questions should we be thinking about when we think about the messiness? Where can you start?
Ooh, that's a really good question. You know, I would always say start with the self-positional first. So starting with that positionality work, understanding, you know, not only how you are positioned, but also how you choose to exert your agency in the ways you choose to position yourself and leverage, excuse me, your identities, your resources, frameworks, right? In order to do that messy work, and knowing that it takes time. So for instance, you know, something I do pragmatically as an executive director, that I've really been pushing philanthropy on, and partners on, is having like a planning for equity period, for instance, right? Where, for instance, it's like 6 months and we're not necessarily doing quote unquote performative task and work. We're literally just building relationship because that's necessary, right, to have a strong foundation. So that's even something really pragmatic that I think that folks can start doing, is even thinking about how can we create pauses within whatever it is that we're doing, whatever it is that we're planning, and even shift the way that we exist with one another as well. That could even be, for instance, in meetings, rather than just simply jumping into the meetings, right? How can you center mind, body, and soul first, right? And really see one another before jumping into the transactional side of the work.
Thank you. We do have a few minutes left for Q&A. So for folks that are visiting with us today, please add your questions into the chat, the webinar Q&A at the bottom, and I will read those out. Who is doing the work well? Is one question to start us with.
Wow. So who is doing the work well? Definitely, I'm gonna name us, right? Like shout out to the ASPA, but also shout out to Project Voice, right? Project Voice is doing really dope work. They're our sister organization. You know, the former founder, Candy Sedibata, amazing woman. Vanessa, the current ED, amazing woman. Her team is amazing. They're doing some really dope healing justice work as well. So shout out to them, Student Voice, Student Leadership. Also doing some really dope work, Colorado Youth Congress, Colorado Black Health, Collaborative as well, doing some really dope work as well. Really appreciate them and their partnership with regards to connecting like mental health and vaping, right, and the criminalization around that, and specifically flavored tobacco products as well. And I can go on and on.
The next question is, can you share any stories about youth participants in your program and what are they working on?
Yeah, oh my goodness. So one of the things that I think is really dope about our work with GASPA, again, is about really trying to add exposure to what's unknown, right? So for instance, back to my story, thinking, oh, I'm gonna be a lawyer, right? And in thinking I was gonna be a lawyer, I went to college not even knowing what a major was, right? So I had to be told about political science and criminology, right? So one of the things we do at YASPA is ensure that our young people are aware of the myriad of options and majors. And so we have young people who will come to us. We ask them, you know, what are your career aspirations? And, you know, what do you think you want to do for a major? I promise you, it's typically not ethics, ethnic studies or political science, and some of these other areas of social science, oftentimes because they're not necessarily exposed to it. But as they matriculate into higher ed, usually they're like, you know what, I'm going to add political science because of GASPA. Or I'm going to add public policy, or I'm going to like double major and add ethnic studies in that. And even for my dissertation, it's not a finding, I would say. But I see this with our youth village in that they rely a lot on ethnic studies actually to survive, even like political science spaces and public policy spaces, right? Because of that critical lens around race and racism and understanding the way that moves in their bodies and in these spaces and systems. So that's super dope. As far as things they're working on, we just recently released a second concurrent enrollment racial equity report this academic year. Our first one was in 2018, which was very much kind of more policy wonky, you know, mixed methods, with some interviews of practitioners who work in the field. This most recent one was co-authored with youth, which was really dope. So it was based upon their youth participatory action research. And so they connected transit equity with concurrent enrollment, but their final call was to have ethnic studies as an emphasis and required in concurrent enrollment, which I think is brilliant, right? Because we know from research that academic and career efficacy is absolutely tied to racial identity development. And so super excited about that work that our youth have been working on. They've also been focusing on anti-criminality as well of youth. They definitely, in the racial reckoning, were looking at SROs, which is very different district to district. Colorado is a local control state, right? And so very different even next door from Denver to Aurora Public Schools to Cherry Creek Public Schools. And so understanding those nuances as well as it pertains to not only SROs, but mental health as well, and criminalization of vaping as almost like a coping mechanism as well, that youth have been seeing. So super excited about that work as well.
So we do have a few more questions, and I'll get the ball rolling. First, what barriers does YASPA have to overcome while navigating Colorado and/or national spaces?
Barriers. It's a good question. It's a good question because our motto is actually redefining the standards to pull down the barriers. And so we're constantly trying to redefine standards, right, on our own terms, like build something different, right, in order to even eradicate certain barriers that we may come across. Um, one constantly, of course, is thinking about multi-year funding, right? So I'm the hustler of the organization, right? We have some multi-year grants, right? But they aren't all multi-year grants. And so that hustle gets real with regards to maintaining, retaining, and finding these grants. With regards to something else, with regards to kind of Colorado and national spaces, something I've really been grappling with is what does expansion mean and what does it look like and feel like for those that we partner with? I say that because what I would not want to do is perpetuate sort of a colonial way of expansion, right? Because a lot of the work we do is place-based. So I'm from Aurora, born and raised, right? My parents are from Denver, right? And so I'm a Cherry Creek school parent, right? I went to Cherry Creek Public Schools. And so like those are the districts that we work within with the youth village. And so in thinking about like doing like that place-based type of work, it would be really important to me to be very intentional, right? When going into other communities, again, like I was saying at the beginning, unveiling what's already there, right? And being in partnership in some way. If we were to expand to these other communities rather than just going in as though nothing else exists. That's really important to me.
Where can we learn more about your work and Black finesse?
Yeah. So definitely my dissertation for sure. But I also, I recently wrote an article about my psychological negotiations of even building my dissertation actually through the prism of Black finesse and in darkened inquiry. So that's a more recent article that I just published fall of last year of 2021.
Just to clarify, where was that published or how could folks locate the article?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Google Scholar for sure. And it's open access as well. So if I stop sharing screen, I could look it up really quick and drop it in the chat. It's helpful.
Because guess what I'm going to be looking for after this?
Absolutely, absolutely. I appreciate that.
And while we are typing and finding the article, the last question is, how can people learn more about your curriculum for middle and high school students?
How can people learn more about my curriculum? So this is a good and fascinating and interesting question. I say that because like we don't give out our curriculum, right? Early on in my journey, I didn't understand, right, how folks will try to digest and take, right, and then try and co-opt. And that happened to me very early on when I was first building YASPA's curriculum. I was like, oh, here you go, right? Here's what we do. And they literally tried to co-opt it at that particular school. And so I wouldn't necessarily, folks can necessarily like find out more necessarily about our curriculum. I would just refer back to the 4 anchors of the organization and indicate that that is the ways in which we move our curriculum. That's the ways in which we hold space in any of our spaces, whether it's like our youth council spaces or specifically our course model at the middle school or the high school level as well.
Thank you.
Absolutely. I'm looking for, oh, here we go. found it. So here is in the chat a link to the most recent article.
Wonderful. And that is also via Google Scholar and open to the public. And we now have the link as well. Internal tensions of building a dissertation through the lens of Blackness toward decolonizing higher education. That is an incredible title. And thank you. Well, I believe that is all the questions that we have. So I will bring us to a close today by saying thank you so much for joining us. And thank you to our audience for joining us today for the Spring 2022 ABC. It's been wonderful being part of this dialogue and conversation. And thank you so much. We will stop our recording now, but thank you, Janiece.